He ran Chicago's most powerful criminal empire from a wheelchair he didn't need, behind dark glasses, hiding eyes that saw everything. His fiancée left the moment she thought he was broken, and he let her walk, because he already knew. His brother shook his hand over paperwork designed to steal his life, dry-palmed, calm, rehearsed. And the woman scrubbing his floors? She knew exactly who he was. She just needed him to figure it out first. Vance Moreno didn't lose his sight. He chose to close his eyes because it was the only way to finally see who was real. But the one person who passed every test was the one person he had no right to ask anything of. What happens when the most powerful man in the room realizes his greatest enemy was the version of himself he'd been protecting for 36 years? Stay with me. This story will hit you somewhere you didn't expect. Here on this channel, we tell stories about powerful men brought to their knees, not by enemies, but by love. Stories about mafia bosses, broken families, impossible choices, and the quiet, stubborn courage it takes to become someone worth trusting. The deepest betrayals don't come from enemies. They come from the lies we build around ourselves because we're too afraid to need someone. If this story reached something real in you, drop a below, leave a comment telling me who you think was the bravest character, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss the next one. New stories drop every week. And I promise, they only get better.
At 36, he ran an empire of crime and commerce, a network so impenetrable the feds had failed for 8 years to find a crack. He was utterly alone in his penthouse, but the silence was a victory. His trap, built from the fiction of his blindness and paralysis, had finally closed. The liars and the vultures who had circled him were gone. The entire plot was born in a hospital bed at Northwestern Memorial, not from a plan, but from an instinct carved into his bones. Lying still with his eyes closed, he listened to a world that thought he couldn't hear. His own lawyer, Warren Sable, spoke on the phone in the hallway, not about Vance's pain, but about contingency plans. He discussed asset protection and who would temporarily take control. Not once did he ask if Vance's men, Eddie or Ray, had families. It was all about the empty chair, and in those moments, listening to the cold calculus of power, a decision hardened inside him. The ambush that put him there was 14 seconds of chaos on a rain-slicked lakeshore drive. Boxed in by 2 black SUVs, the world dissolved into shattering glass and gunpowder. His driver, Eddie, died instantly, mid-sentence about his daughter's acceptance to med school. His bodyguard, Ray, fired back 3 times before bullets tore through him. Vance hit the floor, the scent of ripped leather and blood filling his lungs as he counted the seconds until silence returned. A silence that cost him 2 loyal men. When Dr. Philip Nolan arrived, his hands trembled. He had been the Moreno family's physician for 20 years. After a quick exam, he confirmed what Vance already knew. He was fine. A few cuts, bruised ribs, nothing more. It was then that Vance, looking at the doctor, laid out the new reality. From that moment on, Vance Moreno was to be declared blind and paralyzed from a severe spinal injury. Nolan would be his only physician, no other examinations allowed. The doctor stared at him for 17 minutes, the silence thick with an old, unspoken debt. 12 years prior, Vance had rescued Nolan's kidnapped son from a warehouse when the police had nothing. It was a favor that had never been called in. As the heart monitor beeped out the passing minutes, the doctor weighed his ethics against a life he owed. Finally, he gave a single sharp nod. He stepped into the hall and delivered the lie. The machine built to replace Vance instantly roared to life. That relentless need for truth began 5 years earlier, in another room at the same hospital. His father, the man who built the empire with his bare hands, lay dying. Old man Moreno had killed his first man at 26 and spent a lifetime trying to wash his hands clean of it. His final words to Vance were a warning, spoken in Italian. Power is not inherited. It must be taken back every day from the very men who bow to you. At his father's funeral, Vance stood among 400 people, knowing at least 30 of them had wanted the old man dead. He knew then he had to rebuild everything, not with fists and guns, but with his Northwestern finance degree, the one weapon his father never had. He had to know who was loyal to the man and who was just loyal to the throne. And so, he devised a test that only the truly desperate or the truly brilliant would ever attempt. Vance sat by the window, watching the city lights blur into a soft glow. The black glasses were on the table, folded. The wheelchair was gone. In the kitchen, a woman hummed softly, a simple tune that filled the 6,500 square feet of the penthouse more completely than years of hollow silence ever had. Her name was Raina. He had learned her name, and in doing so, had learned what it felt like to have someone in his home who wanted nothing more than to just be there. This quiet moment was the answer to a question he hadn't known how to ask. This peace was purchased with a lie. It began the day he let Priscilla Ashton walk out of his life for good. He remembered the sound of her expensive heels on the granite floor, a decisive, hurried rhythm, the sound of a decision all Rainady made. She had sat by his hospital bed, her eyes just red enough to be convincing, and delivered a perfectly rehearsed speech about not being strong enough, about needing space. She was terminating a contract, not a relationship. As she spoke, he simply listened, and for the first time in years, he felt the profound relief of a bad investment finally being cut loose. He felt relief because he knew it was a performance. He had set the stage himself. For 5 days in that hospital room, he had played the part of a blind, broken man. He'd missed the water glass sitting 6 inches from his hand, just to hear the change in her brain a thing, not the sharp gasp of fear, but the quiet, calculating pause of someone assessing a loss. He'd let his leg fall limp to the bed and heard her swallow, the dry sound of an asset depreciating. He didn't need to see. Her actions painted a clearer picture than his eyes ever could. The final confirmation came through the door she thought was closed. He heard her on the phone, her voice calm and professional, asking her own lawyer how a permanent disability would trigger their prenuptial agreement. She spoke of percentages and timelines, dissecting their future as if it were an apartment lease. Lying there, staring at a ceiling he could see perfectly, he wasn't angry, he was just awake. But why stage such a grim theater? Why feign blindness to see the truth? Because for 5 years, Vance Moreno had been the most powerful and loneliest man in Chicago. He'd transformed his family's criminal enterprise into an invisible empire of shell companies, legal casinos, and silent partnerships that controlled the city from the shadows. He was a ghost in a suit, too clean to arrest and too powerful to touch. The sound of the 3.2-carat diamond ring hitting the polished oak was the only sound in the penthouse. It wasn't loud, but it was final. Priscilla turned and walked away, her heels clicking as steady ran out down the hall, leaving Vance to count the 22 minutes it took for him to rainalize. He felt nothing at all. Her leaving didn't hurt. The absence of pain did. It was a cold confirmation that their love had been just another transaction in a life full of them. This hollow feeling was the stage for the Raynal betrayal, the one that truly mattered. 3 days earlier, Tristan Hale had walked into his hospital room, smelling of the expensive cologne Vance had given him. He didn't come to comfort, but to collect. He brought paperwork to grant himself temporary authority, speaking 11 sentences in total. 9 were about business, 2 were empty expressions of concern. Vance, feigning blindness, deliberately signed in the wrong place, a simple test. Tristan didn't hesitate. He didn't offer to Reynad the documents or ask if Vance understood what he was signing over. Instead, he simply took Vance's hand, moved it to the correct spot, and said, "Right here, brother," in the patient tone one uses for a child. He trainated his brother's supposed disability not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. The plan was working perfectly. After securing the signature, Tristan shook his hand, a habit of 10 years. The handshake lasted exactly 3 seconds, but his palm was completely dry. Not the cold hand of a frightened man or the damp hand of a worried one, but the dry hand of someone closing a deal. In that moment, Vance knew the man he'd once taken a bullet for was no brother at all. That handshake was colder than any goodbye Priscilla could ever offer. After Tristan left, Vance listened to the silence grow. In the first days after the news broke, the phone had buzzed 47 times with calls from so-called friends and partners. He had over 800 contacts. 47 was already an answer. The calls were a performance of loyalty, and like any performance, it had a short run. By the seventh day, the calls dropped to 12. By the second week, the expensive flowers that once crowded the room began to wilt, the water in their vases turning cloudy. No one came to change them. The gestures of concern stopped as quickly as they had started, leaving behind only the smell of decay. On the 21st day, there was nothing. 0 calls, 0 messages, only the beep of the heart monitor and the silence of a world that had forgotten him. Sitting in that wheelchair, Vance realized that when people believe you cannot see them, they stop pretending. And in their honesty, he saw the truth. His entire world was a stage. It was then, in that profound quiet, that he knew his plan had to be seen through to its bitter, necessary end. It all started the night of the crash, when he opened his eyes in the wreckage, the only survivor, and chose to keep them shut. But every call came with a demand, and every smile had an invoice attached. At 36, he sat at the head of a table built for 8 and ate every meal alone. His penthouse on the 47th floor wasn't a home. It was a gilded cage suspended in the sky, a tomb with a view. He realized the power he'd built had only bought him isolation. The only way to discover who would remain if he had nothing was to pretend it was all gone. So, one morning, in a sterile hospital room, this man who saw everything decided to close his eyes and pretend he couldn't see a thing. The soft click of the lock echoed in the penthouse, a sound more final than any gunshot. Vance stood frozen, his powerful hands useless on the oak table. He was no longer the blind, paralyzed man in the wheelchair. He was just a liar his children had seen exposed. "Daddy?" Stella's sleepy voice came from the hall. "Where did Raina go?" Across from her, his son Arlo stood in a doorway, his gray eyes missing nothing. There was no shock on his face as he stared at his standing father, only a crushing disappointment that felt heavier than any anger. Just moments before, that disappointment had been in Raina's eyes. She had found him standing, the entire charade collapsing in an instant. Her voice, when she spoke, wasn't loud, but each word was a blade. "You performed weakness for me," she'd said, her gaze like steel. She knew. She knew he was the Renaissance her husband was dead, knew the pain she carried, and knew he had watched her, measured her grief from behind his black glasses. Her final words, "Don't, it wasn't," cut off his excuse before it was even formed. Then she turned and walked away, closing the door gently on the life he had tried to build on his lies. That life had seemed so close. Only an hour earlier, the penthouse was filled with the sounds of family. His mother, Francesca, had brought the twins. It was the first time in 4 years his children had been there. He remembered the chime of the private elevator and the sound of his 6-year-old daughter, Stella, running toward his wheelchair. She had climbed right into his lap, unafraid, wrapping her arms around his neck and asking why he wore sunglasses inside like a spy. He had held her, playing the part of the disabled father, soaking in a moment of connection that he hadn't earned. The connection with Raina had felt just as Rainal. It began with her quiet acts of kindness. She started coming on unscheduled days, leaving containers of food on the table. First, hot rice. Then, chicken soup. Finally, a loaf of homemade brainade. The nurse would renade him the simple notes. "Eat while it's warm." There were no requests, no invoices, just simple, unconditional care. It was a kindness offered not out of pity, but out of choice, and it had shaken him more than any business deal. He had even asked her why she came on extra days. "Big house, lots of dust. she'd said, a small, polite lie they both accepted. That lie rested between them, a fragile bridge built on a much larger one. She never pitied him. While others would have patted his shoulder or guided his hand, Raina trainated him just as she always had, like the man who hired her to clean his home. She moved around his wheelchair with practiced efficiency, her presence marked only by the scent of cleaning solution and soap. She did her job, and then a little more, just enough to make it clear it was her decision. For the first time, the penthouse brain-ached. Vance sat in his wheelchair, hidden behind dark glasses, listening to his children's noise fill the 6,500 square feet. Stella sang off-key in the kitchen while Arlo fought for a window seat. Vance heard his daughter ask the housekeeper if she was his girlfriend. Then, a sound he hadn't made in years, a deep, genuine laugh, shook his chest. This fragile piece was an ultimatum, delivered a week before by his sister Francesca. She'd brought the children, her voice low and steady as she told him this was his last chance to be a father. She said they didn't need a perfect man, just a present one. Then she kissed his forehead and walked into the elevator without looking back, leaving him with a life he had to pretend to deserve. But the foundation of this new world was a lie, and he confessed it one morning. "I can see," he told Raina the housekeeper. "I can walk." He watched the kindness in her brown eyes harden into cold steel. Her trust shattered instantly. "It was all fake?" she asked, her voice flat. The blindness, the chair, every moment of her misplaced care had been part of his deception. It all began with that first performance. His 6-year-old son Arlo stood in the doorway, a small, serious reflection of Vance himself. He didn't run to his father. He simply watched, calculating. His hands were still trembling from the weight of his act. "Dad can't see me?" Arlo asked, his voice devoid of any childishness. "No," Vance said from his chair. "Dad can't walk." There was a pause. Then Arlo asked the one question that sliced through the entire charade, the one question for which the powerful Vance Moreno had no Reynal answer. Around the grand oak table, a place once defined by silence, life had finally taken root. 4 people sat where only one had ever sat in solitude. Vance, at the head of the table in his wheelchair, listened to the sound of his daughter Stella's non-stop chatter and watched his son Arlo, a boy walled off from the world, actually take a second helping of enchiladas. He looked at Reina, who sat in the middle, effortlessly tending to the children, and thought this was the most expensive meal of his life. Not for the food, but for the monumental lie he was paying for it with. Every laugh and every bite was a train-assure he had stolen, and he knew the bill would eventually come due. But that fragile piece was only possible because, hours earlier, he had chosen to tear down the lie himself. He had waited for Reina at that same table, not in his wheelchair, not behind dark glasses, but as himself. He watched her walk in and stop cold. He saw the confusion on her face morph into dawning horror as her eyes met his, truly met them, with a clarity no blind man could ever possess. And in that instant, she knew. Reina Solano was not a woman who needed a confession to believe what she could see with her own 2 eyes. The choice to confess had been forged in the dead of night. It wasn't about courage, it was about fear. Not for himself, but for Reina. He'd received a message that his rival, Tristan, had started investigating her. Suddenly, his cruel test wasn't a game anymore. It was a loaded weapon pointed at an innocent woman and her child. Vance realized that every second he continued the charade, he was leaving them in the line of fire. He had to end it. He had to tell her the truth before he dealt with Tristan, so she would know his apology was genuine, not just another move in a calculated game. Tristan's methods were thorough and cold. In just 3 days, he knew everything about Reina Solano, her neighborhood, her young son, her mother's illness, her second job. To a man like Tristan, this information wasn't about a person. It was leverage. She had become a pawn, a weakness to be exploited. And Vance couldn't let that happen. The image of Reina and her son on the bus became intertwined with the image of Tristan examining her life like a predator picking its prey. As the elevator doors slid shut, Vance sat motionless in the dark. In the cold calculus his father had taught him, Tristan Hale was already a dead man. He just hadn't been informed. This resolution settled minutes after a quiet, chilling test. A whisper of steel sliding from a leather sheath, a sound Vance knew like his own name. For 3 heartbeats, Tristan stood behind the wheelchair, knife in hand, ready to kill the helpless man he thought his boss had become. And for 3 heartbeats, Vance didn't flinch, didn't alter his brain a thing, offering no sign he knew. Then, the sound of the blade returning to its sheath. Tristan wasn't Rainady, not yet. A few nights of hollow conversation about business followed before Tristan shook his dry hand and left. He had shown up without warning, using the private key Vance had given him 5 years prior, a brother's privilege. He found Vance in the darkened living room, a silhouette against the city lights, and stood behind him. Close enough for Vance to smell the cologne he'd gifted him on the man contemplating his murder. The visit was a lie, a predator circling its prey, but Vance had played his part perfectly. At 4 in the morning, Vance's hand rested on his son's hair. In the quiet of the penthouse on the 47th floor, it was the closest the two had ever been. This fragile connection was forged after Arlo, his 6-year-old, diagnosed the pain his father thought was invisible. The boy couldn't see the guilt, but he could hear it. "Dad, Brainath is different," Arlo had whispered in the dark, explaining a sound like something heavy lodged in his father's chest. For Vance, the boy's words were the final crack in a foundation that had been crumbling for 4 nights straight, ever since he had been forced to see the truth. His sleepless torment began with sprained sheets. The neat lines of data he had ignored for years suddenly had names and faces. Holstead Receivable Closed was no longer a business term. It was Andre Solano, a man left to die on cold concrete, leaving behind a family. The second night, he looked at his own children sleeping and was terrified of the man they would discover he was. For 5 years, Tristan had handled the filthy work with clean language, but now the slaughterhouse had a name, a face, and it was scrubbing his kitchen floors. That face was Raina's. She had quietly told him she knew who he was from her very first day. She explained her impossible situation, her mother's stage 3 lung cancer, the $4,700 monthly medication, and the health insurance that only a job cleaning for him could provide. She had spoken of her husband's death and the 2 words that officially ended his life: insufficient evidence. She was surviving by swallowing what she should have spat out, mopping the floors of the man who had indirectly caused her family's destruction. Her strength, she admitted, came from a moment of complete despair. 6 months after Andre died, she had stood on a pier, ready to let the black water of Lake Michigan silence her pain. It wasn't courage that pulled her back, but the imagined cry of her 1-year-old son calling for his mother. That sound was why she chose to live and walk into the home of her enemy, waiting for the right moment to make him see. The performance, the blind eyes and paralyzed limbs, was a trap he'd set from the beginning. Vance never trusted anyone, and that instinct had just saved his life. Through a listening device planted in Tristan's office long ago, he'd heard the proof he both expected and drainated. In the dead of night, on a secret phone, he listened to Tristan's voice, stripped of loyalty, speaking not to him, but about him. He was plotting with Vin Kowalski, a Southside rival, to take over the organization. The deal was struck over dim sum. Vance was finished, Tristan had assured him, a vegetable in a wheelchair. Kowalski asked when they could clean up, as if discussing a spill, not a man's life. Tristan needed more time to secure his position, to ensure Vance's eventual second accident raised no suspicion. In exchange, Kowalski would get the Southern Territories. Vance listened to their wine glasses toast to his death, and in the darkness of his room, closed his eyes to think. The betrayal wasn't a surprise. It was the certainty of it that was so exhausting. He had always known Tristan was a snake, yet he'd called him brother. But the real danger emerged 2 days later, when a loyal bodyguard reported that Tristan was now asking questions about Raina, the cleaning woman. Her presence was an unknown variable, and Tristan didn't like loose ends. Suddenly the danger had a face, and it was the one person Vance wanted to shield from his world. It all led back to a quiet night in the kitchen, long after the penthouse staff had gone. He'd asked about her life outside these walls, and she'd told him. Her voice never wavered as she spoke of her husband, Andre Solano, shot dead 3 years ago behind a laundromat. He wasn't a good man, he was a drinker, a gambler, and he hit her. But he was her son's father. The police investigation went nowhere, closed for insufficient evidence. The truth came 6 months later in a drunken 2 a.m. phone call from one of Andre's old friends. He'd died over a gambling debt. After 2 warnings, the third came with bullets. The debt was owed to the Moreno family. She said the name, his name, without emotion, a simple, devastating fact laid bare on the kitchen table between them. What had changed him? It wasn't one single event, but a series of quiet moments. It was Reina, staying late without pay to press a cool cloth to Stella's feverish forehead simply because a sick child had asked her to. It was the two of them in the kitchen late at night, sharing a comfortable silence that felt more Raynal than any conversation he'd had in years. She wasn't just an employee anymore. She was the person who was slowly, unintentionally, showing his children what a home could feel like. In fact, she'd been brainacking down walls from the very beginning. Days after she started, his son Arlo, a child wrapped in defensive silence, had asked her a question with his piercing gray eyes. And instead of offering a platitude, Raina gave him the one thing no one else had: blunt honesty. "Why do you clean our house?" he had asked. Raina looked straight at the 6-year-old and answered without a hint of softness. "Because your house is dirty." After a long, assessing stare, Arlo turned and walked away. But from that day forward, the door to his room was never fully closed again. Just a crack. For a boy who didn't know how to ask for a hug, it was the next best thing. And that's how it all started. Not with a grand plan, but with a few honest words and a half-open door. Then what can Dad still do? And in that moment, faced with the son he'd barely known, Vance began the biggest lie of his life, hoping it would finally lead him to some kind of truth. And it was all a test. From the very beginning, he had orchestrated the entire deception. He sat in the wheelchair that first morning, listening to the sounds of her working, the running water, the rag wrung out over a bucket. In his world, the help was meant to be invisible, part of the furniture. But he made himself weak to see if she was Raynal, to measure her heart while knowing he was the one who had broken it. He listened to her clean his home, a woman whose life he had destroyed, and waited. "If Daddy can stand, then pick me up." It was 2 in the morning, and those 7 words from his daughter cut through all the lies. Stella stood there, hugging a pillow, her voice drowsy. She didn't ask why he'd lied. She just needed her father. Vance, standing without his wheelchair or dark glasses for the first time in front of her, finally understood. His voice was rough when he answered, "Yeah, Daddy can stand." It was the first honest thing he'd said in months, and the beginning of putting his shattered family back together. That moment of connection only happened because he'd first been utterly alone. For 48 hours, the penthouse felt like a tomb. After Raina left, the silence was absolute. 6:47 a.m. came and went twice with no key in the door. Vance stared at the entrance the first morning, counting seconds to keep from brainacking. The second morning, he didn't bother. Waiting for something you've destroyed is a unique kind of hell. Arlo had retrainated into a new, deeper silence, locking himself away emotionally. His son's silence was a direct consequence of the lie being exposed. It had been swift and brutal. "Dad lied," Arlo had stated, his voice flat and empty. The boy's gray eyes were unblinking. Did Dad lie when Dad said Dad loves me? That question shattered Vance. His denial was a broken whisper. But Arlo's final words, delivered with the gravity of a judge, were the ones that echoed as Raina quietly closed the door behind her for the last time. Then why did Dad think lying was the way to find out who loves Dad? That question revealed the entire charade. Vance, a powerful man, had orchestrated a massive deception, confining himself to a wheelchair. He had tested everyone around him, desperate to find someone who wouldn't be swayed by his wealth or power. He wanted to find genuine connection for his children and himself. He set up the elaborate test to see who was Raynal, never once considering that the person his son would stop trusting was him. In his quest to find out who truly loved his family, he had broken his son's faith and driven away the one person who had passed his test. And in the end, he was left with the one truth he had tried to avoid. The deepest betrayals often come from the lies we tell ourselves. Model. Standing on the 47th floor with Chicago glittering below, Vance held his daughter. She didn't need him to conquer the world, only to pick her up. 40 pounds, heavier than his entire empire, because for the first time in 4 years, he held her simply because she'd asked. Stella's small arms wrapped around his neck, her sleepy warmth a grounding weight against his shoulder. Her complete, trusting brainath was the only thing strong enough to hold him here. This peace was the new foundation of his life. This new life was built on hard choices made in the quiet of the morning. Waking on the sofa with Stella still asleep on his chest, Vance knew he had to clear the battlefield before he could stand at Raina's door. He made 2 calls, not to hired guns, but to men bound by decades of family loyalty. He told them to be at the Randolph Street restaurant at 11 o'clock, that he would be there, standing, walking, and seeing. Everything was about to change. And at 11 that morning, the change arrived. The basement door swung open and Vance walked in. No wheelchair, no dark glasses, just a man on 2 feet, whose sharp gray eyes met those of the 14 stunned men at the table. Tristan Hale, sitting in the boss's chair, went paper white. He looked like a man watching his own ghost walk into the room. The boss wasn't blind, he wasn't paralyzed, and he was looking right at him. Vance didn't raise his voice. He walked to the head of the table and spoke with cold finality. "I know everything," he said, detailing every betrayal, right down to the knife Tristan held behind his wheelchair in the dark. In the suffocating silence, Tristan's hand trembled. He was hauled from the chair and taken away, a coward exposed by the light. Vance then addressed the room. Within 2 years, the Moreno organization would be completely legitimate. He was doing it for his children. The U-Haul, driven by Vance Moreno himself, was a sight no one in his world would have believed. Inside the new house, the air smelled of fresh paint and pepperoni pizza, a jarringly domestic scene he was slowly learning to build. A boy named Arlo commanded 2 of Vance's toughest men on the precise placement of a sofa. "A little more to the left," he ordered, his hands on his hips, and the men, who wouldn't flinch from federal agents, obeyed the child without question. This fragile piece was born from 6 inches of space. That was all Reina Solano had given him weeks ago, not an invitation, just a door opened a crack, a sliver of maybe. He honored it with silence, waiting a full week before returning in his old Ford F-150. He knocked, and when her son Miguel opened the door, he simply offered to take the boy to the park while she worked. "Bring him back before 5, she'd said, her voice flat, "and he's allergic to peanuts." On a chipped green bench in Harrison Park, Vance watched the 4-year-old endlessly climb and slide, a small engine of pure joy. It was the first time he had ever just sat in a park, observing the son of the woman whose husband his own organization had killed. It became their quiet routine. Once a week, then twice, he would arrive in his old truck and simple jeans, leaving the powerful Vance Moreno behind to be a man who takes a boy to the park. But every one of those visits hinged on the moment he first stood at her blue door, stripped of his lies. He arrived with empty pockets and no promises, only a raw truth. "I came because if I didn't," he told her, his voice uneven, "I'd stay the man I've been for 36 years. And I don't want to be that man anymore." Her eyes, shadowed with exhaustion, held no warmth. "You think showing up once changes your whole life?" "No," he said. "But not showing up guarantees nothing changes at all." It was her son, Miguel, who unknowingly intervened. "Mommy, let him come in," the boy urged, tugging her hand. "It's cold outside." The chill he felt wasn't from the November air, but from the space between two people separated by a grave. And she had relented, not with words, but by nudging the door open those crucial 6 inches. He knocked on that door because of a debt that could never truly be paid. A child's innocent voice saying, "Dad Brainathy's different," was the ghost that drove him from his old life. It was a constant reminder of the man he'd wronged in a parking lot on Halsted Street, a debt that demanded a beginning, even if it could never have an end. He knew starting over would be harder than the 10 years of destruction that came before. The new house in Lincoln Park finally felt like a home, a stark contrast to the penthouse Vance had sold. It wasn't about the money, it was about leaving a symbol of power behind for a simple backyard with a maple tree. This new life hadn't been a grand gesture, but a quiet conversation over cold pizza in Raina's small kitchen. It was built from small requests: a garage for a new bicycle, a dark purple bedroom, and the unified demand for a dog, which began as a negotiation for a fish. It was a foundation laid by two children who knew that together they could win any battle. But that family decision was only possible because of a single fragile moment one frozen Chicago night. They sat on the apartment stairs, the sound of distant sirens in the air. "I'm afraid of you," Raina confessed. Not of him hurting her, but of him offering a hope she couldn't afford to lose. Vance admitted his own fear, that he wasn't worthy of her trust. "You're not," she agreed, her voice holding no bitterness, only truth. Then, she leaned her head against his shoulder. The weight of it was heavier than his entire empire, a burden of trust from a woman who had every renaissance to walk away, but chose to stay. That moment of trust had been earned over a year of painstaking work. For his son, Arlo, it meant facing a door that was shut tighter than before. After being lied to, the boy's trust was shattered. Vance's approach was simple: a soft knock each morning, a quiet, "Dad's out here," and then he would walk away. After 2 weeks, Arlo finally opened the door a crack. "I don't need words anymore," the 6-year-old said, his voice heavy. "I need to see." That sliver of an opening was a final chance, a demand for proof. For Raina, it was a different kind of test. When she discovered Vance had anonymously paid her mother's staggering medical bills, she was furious. It wasn't help, it was him taking away the one thing she had left, the right to care for her own family. Her voice trembled on the phone, a mix of anger and unshed tears. "Next time," she said, her voice softening just slightly before she hung up, "ask me first." In those 2 words, Vance heard everything. She was giving him a next time, something he knew he hadn't earned. And so he had asked, not with words, but with actions. It all started with him parking 2 blocks away from her apartment just to walk over. He never pushed. He just showed up and did one small thing no one asked him to. He took her son Miguel to the park so she could work. He fixed the faucet her landlord had ignored for months. He sat quietly with her sleeping son so she could visit her mother in the hospital. Each small, selfless act was a single brick laid in the foundation of something new. That was how the inches of an open door slowly widened. It wasn't a grand decision or a dramatic change. It began with the quiet, persistent effort of a man trying to rebuild a world he himself had broken, one small favor at a time, to let him in. Which is why, weeks earlier, Vance Moreno sat shrouded in a lie. In his penthouse, he played the part of a broken man in a wheelchair, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses, his world supposedly confined to darkness. He was waiting for his new caretaker. When Reina Solano walked in, a grieving widow just trying to survive, she saw only a blind man needing help. She had no idea he could see her perfectly, that he was the architect of her pain, watching her and desperately hoping to find a renaissance to change. That decision led to this new home. To Francesca, the family's old cook, pulling Reina into a fierce, welcoming hug, her eyes wet with tears and happiness. It led to the 3 children, Arlo, Stella, and Miguel, insisting on a sleepover in the living room on their first night. Blankets on the floor, whispers and giggles fading into sleep. It all started because a little girl, smelling of shampoo and sleep, simply asked her father to hold her. And in his arms, she reminded him what was truly worth fighting for. The house finally became a home when their laughter filled it. In the kitchen, surrounded by unpacked boxes, Raina and Vance stood watching the maple tree in the yard. This simple kitchen, with its laminate counter and white cabinets, felt more Raynal than the penthouse ever had. She asked if everything would be okay, not from worry, but from a life of knowing that peace is fragile. He looked at her, truly looked, with his gray eyes no longer hidden behind dark glasses. "I think it's been okay for a while," he said. "I just had to get brave enough to admit it." For the first time, she gave him the kind of full, unguarded smile he'd only ever seen her give to her son or her mother. But that smile was earned. To get there, Vance had to learn that Raynal's strength wasn't in an $80,000 air filtration system, but in standing still and letting her come to him. He had to walk away from the cold empire he'd built, the fortress that almost cost him everything. It was his own stubbornness that nearly lost her, the foolishness of a 37-year-old man who could build anything except a Raynal connection. That night on the stairs in Pilsen, her smile was tired, the smile of a woman stretched to her limit. When she rested her forehead against his, it was a question. His presence there was the answer. "Thank you for coming back," she whispered. He replied, "Thank you for opening the door." And it all started in a place that looked like a home but wasn't. It began in a penthouse where a powerful man hid behind black glasses and a strong woman hid behind restrained smiles. It began with children who were so attuned to the tension that a little boy could hear the difference in his own father's brain a thing. It began with the realization that needing someone isn't a weakness, it's the bravest thing a person can do, model. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.